Thank you so much, Tamara. Thank you, Lisa, and everybody at NACDL. I'd like to welcome all of the attendees. Thank you for being here today, and welcome all of our wonderful panelists. Today we have Alana Jochum from A4TE. We have Whit Washington from Lambda Legal. And we have Ian Thompson from the ACLU. I feel really lucky to be in conversation with all of you. And I'd like to provide a little bit of context before we get started. One thing I will just say is that I'm so grateful for NACDL for organizing this panel and for focusing on this topic and prioritizing the experiences of trans folks in the criminal legal system. As a former public defender who specialized in representing LGBTQ people in criminal cases, I often found myself in between two worlds, right? I was either, in the middle of working with the defense bar, which often was not willing to recognize and prioritize the experiences of trans defendants in the system, or I was working within the broader LGBTQ rights movement, which was not willing to prioritize the needs of criminalized trans people. And so, the intersection of these two issues, of these two worlds, I think couldn't be more important right now in the time that we are living in and the ways that we are seeing criminalization increase. I think it would be it would be dishonest to say that a lot of the issues that we are going to be speaking about today are new issues that came with the Trump administration. The reality is issues around conditions of confinement, issues around mistreatment and discrimination and violence towards trans people by law enforcement, by actors in the criminal legal system, including the defense bar, by prosecutors, by judges. These are all issues that have been a problem throughout history and in recent history too, right? It was always an issue throughout my practice over the past decade and change. And so some of these are not issues that are new, but certainly they are all incredibly heightened. And it is more urgent than ever that we talk about them and figure out how to mitigate the harm as members of the defense bar and advocates. So thank you again for being here. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and ask Alana and Whit the first question as we think about providing the context for which we're having this conversation. I'm hoping that both of you could talk a little bit about the bills that are targeting the trans community throughout the country on the state level. What trends should state advocates anticipate in 2026 regarding this issue?
Yeah, so happy to speak to that. And we have a couple slides that we can show that maybe we'll put this into context. We have seen an assault at the state level for years in terms of advancing anti-trans legislation and policy. It has really been actually, I think, the baseline for what we're now seeing federally and what I'm sure Ian's going to be able to speak to in a little bit. There are more than 600 anti-trans bills in the US right now that have been introduced this year to date. ACLU keeps a tracker. I think this is a wonderful resource for folks to know about. Some organizations track these differently, but at least 616 anti-LGBTQ bills, most of which we know are actually anti-trans. But I do also want to ensure hope here. This is a slide from the Movement Advancement Project. They're tracking more than 723 introduced to date anti-LGBTQ. But the important line to see is the line at the top, this green line. You can see over the years, the orange line increasing of how many bills have been introduced increasingly every legislative session. But consistently, when we show up, when we come together, and when we push back, we defeat them. We consistently defeat about 90% of these anti-trans bills year upon year. Right now, we have seen a huge spike to more than 700, mostly because Texas was in session this year, and Texas saw more than 150 anti-trans bills introduced. But we still have defeated 88% year to date, which is encouraging and something that we must remind ourselves we can actually defeat these. And and I can kind of riff off of each other here if this works. These are the trends that I observed in 2025 of the types of bills that were introduced and successful. There's a wide range of bills that were introduced, but the ones that seemed to really win this year, be passed, included narrowly defining sex in a way that's trying to exclude transgender people, narrowly defining it based on chromosomes or sex assigned at birth or reproductive capability in a way that conflicts with the Bostock decision and trying to exclude transgender people. Many of these were broad definition bills that were not actually applied, meaning it would determine that is something that we have to watch for how these will be weaponized against trans people, but they are broad definitions trying to set the stage to say we are recognizing narrow definitions of sex. Blocking medically necessary care for transgender people who are incarcerated. Flat on, in line with today's presentation, this was one of the most passed types of bills this session in which it would prohibit care outright for transgender people who are incarcerated or prohibit state funding from allowing funds to be used to care for transgender folks for medically necessary care. This is a bill that I expect, as we'll see in the next slide, will continue in 2026. This year, we also saw a lot of bills that prevented state funds from paying for Medicaid for state employees for gender-affirming care or other medically necessary care for trans folks. And then we saw a continuation of seeking to ban transgender athletes from playing on sports teams matching gender identity and banning or otherwise making inaccessible gender-affirming care for transgender youth in new and more expansive ways. Were there any other trends that you saw from this year that you think were relevant here for our group here?
No other trends that I think are relevant, but something that's important to be thinking about as we're looking at these different types of legislation are the ways in which trans folks are criminalized through the enactment of this legislation. So blocking people from paying state funds for Medicaid for gender affirming care when people's IDs are not matching their identity as they present themselves, which can become a problem for people who rely on Medicaid for gender affirming care. The likelihood of the incidence of violence increases, the likelihood of the involvement of the police in a situation that otherwise is a very regular routine thing increases. And so it's just important to think about, as we talk about these types of legislation, they may not seem like criminal law, but the impact that they have is criminalizing trans folks.
That's right. It's creating a criminalized climate is how I would think about it, and subjecting trans folks to increased surveillance, questioning, scrutiny, all of which is going to lead to difficult interactions with people in authority or the criminal legal system. What are we expecting in 2026? I am expecting blocking medically necessary care for transgender people who are incarcerated, those types of bills to continue to advance in earnest. Sadly, we saw them advance in Kentucky, in Georgia. Legal challenges to them have been successful to date to a point. I know that there have been several injunctions granted and then they have been paused. So we're going to continue to fight those on the legal fronts as well. Weaponizing funding streams. This is a method I expect to see more next year. Weaponizing funding streams unless anti-trans policy is adopted or unless non-discrimination protections, so positive policies protecting trans people, are repealed. We saw this happen at the end of session in South Carolina. Funds were going to be withheld from a city unless they repealed an ordinance that protected kids against conversion therapy. The city held out for a few weeks and then ultimately caved to the pressure. I expect this tactic to be utilized a lot next session. Also, expanding attacks on access to medically necessary care for transgender adults. We have mostly seen attacks on access to care for children. However, some bills have now started creeping into either hindering severely access for adults or outright trying to prohibit it. I expect to see more attempts at that next year. Continued efforts to narrowly define sex, and especially to prevent transgender people from accessing restroom and facility spaces. Bathroom bans have increased significantly. 20 states, 20 states now have some sort of bathroom ban against trans folks simply accessing the restroom in their state. And then finally, restricting access to accurate ID documents, which, just as Whit said, that is going to severely hinder people's ability to safely move about their daily lives and will cause interactions with law enforcement or the other criminal systems potentially simply for trying to be who they are and having an ID that is forced upon them to not match who they are. Any other trend types that we expect, Whit, that we've sort of been talking about in our various spaces together that might be helpful for folks here?
I really do think the biggest one that we're going to see is the increase in legislation to prohibit either what it seems like they're doing is prohibiting the initiation of care, which essentially functions as a blanket ban on care, and it's a freeze frame policy, which is the type of policies that advocates had thought they beat in the 2015s. And so what we see, it's a resurgence. And I think what is especially upsetting to me is that, this legislation that they're creating, as I mentioned, um, pushes trans people into the criminal legal system. And then after it pushes folks into the criminal legal system, it doubles down on the violence by not providing care, by housing people not according to their gender identity, by not taking seriously the safety of incarcerated individuals. Um, and so what we see is like a concerted effort of violence from the state against trans people to disappear, harm, and inflict physical and psychological violence. So I think it's really important for us to remember as we're working with trans clients, if we're interacting with trans clients, these are people who have been systematically abused by the state and likely their communities and families for many, many years. And so it's important for us to center ourselves and be willing and open to hear people and with folks and meet them where they're from, because that type of violence can make it difficult to connect with and relate with and work with a public defender in a diversity of ways.
Thank you both so much. I'm hearing that I know there are some bills that very explicitly criminalize trans people by making it a felony to say you are who you are, right? And then there are also bills that sort of perpetuate what's been called the discrimination to incarceration pipeline, right? Which is a phrase or a term coined by scholar and civil rights attorney Chineri Ezie, which essentially describes what you're talking about. The instances in which people experiencing anti-trans discrimination is actually funneling them into the criminal legal system because it makes them more likely to come into contact with law enforcement. And so I appreciate that. And I'm curious what you would say has been. I know, Alana, you said that you've been, knocking out a huge percentage of these bills every year. How are you doing that? What's an effective strategy that folks can take away from this?
That's a really great question. And I wish that I had a better answer for us all than this, but it literally is utilizing every possible tactic to defang, to delay, to deflect. Everything procedurally that we have at our fingertips in any given state is what we use to try to slow down the progress of these bills, to educate folks sincerely about the harm that is being caused on them by them, but procedural tactics to try to ensure that they at least don't cross over the finish line. So some of these are waiting in the wings to come back next year and try to get a new fresh start. But oftentimes having real conversations with constituents or legal scholars who can show the unintended or at least perhaps unrecognized by cis lawmakers. Consequences of these bills, mostly cis lawmakers for these bills, has been an effective strategy coupled with these procedural ways to try to gum up the works and simply prevent their passage across the finish line. Sadly, right now, this has become a cudgel of more conservative politics to try to score political points. And we often see these bills passed right before elections, right before a midterm or a state election, as a way to try to build, sadly, credibility in certain parts of a person's portfolio. So when you're pushing against politics, sometimes our educational efforts fall short. We believe our education is the long-term game, and we will never stop doing that. But in the meantime, we have to just use a lot of gumming up the work techniques as well.
Thank you for doing all of that work. Whit, is there anything you want to add?
I just want to say that I think there's an important piece of this, that education piece of this, that I think not a lot of people talk about. But, you know, the the money that is made by increasing the prison population for private companies, private organizations, the federal government and the state government is something important to be thinking about and reflecting on as we talk about decriminalization of people. We're talking about trans folks right now, but I think that across the board, looking at lower incomes folks, looking at Black folks, looking at folks with a disability, and particularly folks who exist at those intersections who, through these like criminal laws and sometimes not criminal laws, increases the workforce in prison, which has a dire economic impact on all of us. And so just wanted to explicitly state that.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to shift a little bit from the focus on states to the federal system. And Ian, this question is for you. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how these issues are evolving and manifesting on the federal level.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be with you all today, and particularly to be with great partners in this space like Alana and Wit. And just thank you for all the work that you're doing, and thank you for NACDL for hosting this conversation. I was really struck when Alana was kind of laying out her presentation about what we've been seeing at the state level, about just how much of that is filtering up to the federal level. And unfortunately, our policymakers at the federal level are really learning all of the wrong and worse lessons from what we've been seeing in the states. But I first wanted to say, kind of what we've been doing as the ACLU, as an organization, kind of at the intersection of these issues so far this year. So, on President Trump's first day in office, he signed an executive order regarding what the administration describes as gender ideology, which required discrimination against trans people across much of the federal government, with a specific mandate to the Federal Bureau of Prisons to deny medical care to incarcerated transgender people in federal prisons, regardless of medical necessity, and to house them in facilities based on their sex assigned at birth, which of course puts trans women at particular risk of violence. As a direct result of this executive order, BOP stopped allowing incarcerated trans people to access clothing or hygiene items consistent with their gender identity, and has barred gender affirming medical care. In March, three trans people currently incarcerated in federal custody filed a class action lawsuit against the administration and BOP, challenging the executive order and the new BOP policies prohibiting their access to gender affirming medical care. And this case was filed on behalf of those three plaintiffs and all other trans people in federal prisons. And it's estimated there are approximately around 2,000 trans people in federal custody today. And that was done by the ACLU of DC, and the wonderful attorneys at the Transgender Law Center. An important note about this case is that this particular case, Kingdom v. Trump, is just about access to gender affirming medical care and other accommodations for gender dysphoria. It is not about placement of trans people in federal custody. There are, however, three other cases Moe v. Trump, Doe v. Bondi, and Jones v. Bondi that have been filed challenging BOP transferring trans women to male facilities. And those lawsuits have resulted in a preliminary injunction preventing these transfers. But of course, the administration has filed an appeal to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and those three cases have been consolidated for briefing and a ruling on the appeal. In June, a federal district court granted a preliminary injunction blocking enforcement of the new prohibition on BOP officials providing gender affirming hormone therapy and accommodations to trans people. The injunction does not require BOP to provide gender-affirming surgical care, but the court also granted the plaintiff's motion for class certification and extended injunctive relief to the full class, which encompasses all persons who are or will be incarcerated in BOP facilities and have a current medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria or who receive that diagnosis in the future. So there have been, of course, awful things done by the administration, but good progress in the lower courts. And all of those battles, both around access to gender affirming medical care and placements, will be playing out in the months to come. So I wouldn't say that I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm pleased that we've been able to block them up to this point, and the fight very much remains alive. One thing that I wanted to note at the federal level, a trend that we have been seeing is for years now, we have been fighting back against efforts to ban access, ban coverage for gender affirming medical care, particularly with federal funds. Those fights have been playing out now for years. But what we are really beginning to see this year is a new trend of efforts to actually criminalize the provision of gender affirming medical care for those under 18 at the federal level. And in June, the House Judiciary Committee advanced legislation, the so-called Protect Children's Innocence Act, and this is H.R. 3492. This legislation, which is sponsored by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, would amend Title 18 with respect to genital and bodily mutilation and chemical castration of minors. The legislation criminalizes gender affirming medical care for those under the age of 18 under existing federal prohibitions on female genital mutilation. At the same time that the bill criminalizes this health care for trans people, it includes, and this is consistent with what we've seen at the state level, it includes an explicit exception for children with intersex variations, supporting the continued use of these non-consensual surgeries on intersex children while criminalizing them for those under the age of 18 who are transgender. This legislation has advanced out of the House Judiciary Committee. We are certainly will do everything that we can to make sure that this is ultimately defeated should they try to bring it to the floor, advance it otherwise. But I think it represents a significant escalation from what we have seen up to this point. The other trend that I am beginning to take note of at the federal level that is kind of a corollary to what Alana and Whit were talking about of trying to very narrowly define sex at the state level in pushing to ban gender affirming medical care at the federal level. I have seen efforts to very broadly define what gender affirming medical care is in these efforts to ban it, to sweep in many aspects around social transition and things like that you would definitely not think of as medical care, but the definitions that we're seeing of what is gender affirming medical care for the purposes of banning it are being defined very broadly to sweep in aspects around social transition as well. So happy to get more into that, but I wanted to note that for folks as well.
That is all incredibly helpful information. Thank you so much, Ian. I know you referenced Trump's executive order on his first day of office, and I remember kind of laughing at what it was called. It was called something along the lines of defending women from gender ideology extremism or something like that. And, it made me think a lot about the ways in which a lot of our opponents, and frankly, even some people who may be allies but are sort of taught to think about these issues in this way, really are buy into this idea that trans women in spaces that are meant for women are a threat, right? And that's, I would say, the primary argument that I've encountered when advocating for conditions of confinement issues for trans people, right? Like, oh, we have to keep cis women safe. And including trans women in those spaces would subject them to, whatever danger they believe exists there. And I'm wondering if any of you can talk a little bit about what are the messages that you are seeing in those spaces when we're advocating for trans people in the criminal legal system? What are these harmful messages that you're encountering, and how do we push back against those messages effectively?
I'm happy to flag something that just happened last night. I can put this in the chat for folks. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas introduced legislation to prohibit placement of trans women in women's facilities. Specifically, Deborah, to your point, with this kind of framing that this is about protecting cisgender women in federal prisons, and that's why we need to take this step. So that kind of framing and that argument that we're doing this to protect women is, very much still resonant for opponents of transgender rights. I mean, it's their go-to. One thing that I have found to be a helpful strategy in pushing back, specifically taking it a little bit broader outside of the criminal legal system context, to the sports example, that's also where this comes up a lot, is highlighting the fact that many of these proposals to ban the participation of transgender girls and women are contingent upon highly invasive, kind of sex testing and examination, really with a target on the backs of all women and girls. But, those who will be significantly harmed by these proposals, of course, are those who don't conform to stereotypical notions about around femininity, be they transgender or not, right? And so that I have found that has been a really helpful strategy in pushing back against some of these efforts, noting that they will harm all women and girls because of the kind of invasive sex testing and investigations that they will subject women and girls to.
Thank you. Yeah, I was listening to I think it was like a reel on Instagram or something that India Moore made recently in response to something that was anti-trans. And India said something that really resonated with me, which was they are trying to punish us. And by us, I think India meant trans women and trans feminine people in general, for the violence that cis men have historically perpetuated against cis women, right? And so that, I think, the reason it resonated with me in this context is because I think, 10 years of representing trans people in in criminal cases, and, I've represented so many incarcerated trans people, and not once in my entire career did a trans woman who was incarcerated in a women's facility, perpetuate any violence towards cis women. However, in every single, literally, case where a trans woman has been housed in a men's facility, she has been assaulted, sexually assaulted, harassed, and experienced gender violence, a form of gender violence. And so, I think that's something that, for me, I find to be sort of a persuasive argument. Just let's look at the numbers, right? Let's look at the statistics of who's actually experiencing harm. But I'm curious. Go ahead, Alana.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I was going to just offer that we have been fighting bathroom bans, which is what we've called them, for more than 10 years. I've often said these are back like a bad penny. We defeated these all in 2015, 2016 through, frankly, having a lot of corporate support. Corporations have permitted trans employees to use restrooms based on their gender identity for many, many years without issue, and we're willing to speak out about that in these settings as these laws were trying to be passed back then. We have seen a pushback on that, and we have seen our corporations sadly retreat and be more quiet than they were at that time. But some of the things that you are speaking to are exactly the antidotes to say, statistically, a person who is going to be predatory in nature is not going to be using a bathroom setting to do that. They are likely to know their victim, be a family member of them, and be a cisgender male. That is just statistically accurate. Bringing that to the fore has been really helpful. And these bills, the existence of these bills in any form, including the form that Ian's talking about here, is just playing into this falsehood that trans people are somehow predatory by nature. And that is what we constantly need to be counteracting in our narratives here. And then the other thing I will say at the state level that has been effective at times for educating is transgender men sharing their own story and explaining how, as they are presenting, where do you want me to use the restroom? And it causes a cognitive dissonance for mostly cisgender lawmakers to say, "Oh, I don't know. And trans men simply saying, "I need to be in the restroom where I am safe," which is a men's restroom, and that has been an experiential tactic that many state groups have helped to educate about the harms of these bills broadly.
And I also, just to add to this, I was speaking to my sister the other day, and she's an educator in a high school in Massachusetts. And one of the things that she was telling me about is the girls at the school were being given a special presentation about domestic violence that the boys weren't a part of. And so, circling back to this conversation, the issue is, regardless of someone's, their sex assigned at birth or their gender identity, the issue that we're running into is masculinity, like regardless of the person. And part of that masculinity is obviously like the patriarchy and this paternal idea about taking care of and creating safety, when actually like it is these ideals that create the lack of safety, like you were talking about. I think it's also important to note that like there are cisgender women in jail for sexual violence, just like there are cisgender men in jail for or in prison for sexual violence, and that like the crimes that people are committing and the harms that are happening are not gender specific. This isn't like gender essentialism. A lot of the violence is a result of our like investment in masculinity and patriarchy. And so I think it's also important to remember that theoretical sort of like overlay.
Thank you so much. I think in answering this question, you actually answered a couple of the other questions I was hoping to ask, which is good because we're running a little low on time. What I want to talk about next, it's actually a couple of questions. I'll ask it, and anybody could feel free to answer. Can you share examples of successful policy changes that improved conditions for transgender people in custody and what made those efforts succeed? What role do formerly incarcerated transgender individuals play in shaping reform efforts, and how can their voices be elevated? So feel free to answer either of those questions or both.
So I think that one of the examples that folks often like to look to for the treatment of incarcerated trans people is SB 132, the transgender. It's the RAD Act. It's the Respect and I can't recall. But it's the RAD Act, and it's the legislation that essentially made it such that folks in California prisons, CDCR, and CDCR custody can be housed where they feel like most safe. So it's not about, it's removing, in some ways, it's removing gender kind of like quite a bit because it's about safety, that people don't always necessarily feel the safest where their gender identity aligns. I know for me personally, as someone who's non-binary and masculine of center, I prefer to go to a women's restroom personally, and have been like roughed up a few times because of that. But what is promising about SB 132 is that it's centering the safety of the individual who's being incarcerated. Um, Prisons don't necessarily like this because it's degendered and about the individual. That creates too many procedural issues. And I think that while the legislation is written well and creates a lot of protection, what we're seeing is an issue around the implementation, that even where there is like a positive policy that allows people to feel safe, um, the issue that we often run into is when there's like a top-down policy or requirement, there are issues around the staff who's with folks every day actually implementing it correctly. And so I think that SB 132 is both an example of like great legislation, and like unfortunate implementation. And I think that what we'll continue to see, and what we often see in the prison space specifically, is how are we monitoring implementation? What organizations are doing some of that oversight? Because I think we're at a point where socially people, I always say in our society, dropping the soap is a joke, and that is about sexual violence to an individual. People are laughing. It's like common to laugh at sexual violence against people. And I think we really need to start addressing that head on, because the staff in prisons who are alone, who like don't have people looking over them all the time, that like society of violence that we're all a part of and we're all entered into creates a really dangerous situation, kind of regardless of the legislation.
Thank you so much, Whit. What you just shared reminds me of a meeting that I was in 2016 with several advocates and the Department of Correction in New York City. We were trying to figure out how to make Rikers Island and other jails in New York City safer for trans people. And before he became a famous attorney, Chase Strangio was at that meeting, and he said something that I will never forget and continue to hold in all of the advocacy I do, which is, when asked what will keep trans people safe, the answer is really having a choice, right? Having autonomy and decision-making power and what will be the safest option for them. It's not a one-size-fits-all policy solution. You can't say, all trans women will be housed in women's facility, all trans men will be housed in men's facility, or whatever, the formula is. You have to let every single individual make that decision for themselves. And the reality is that corrections and our criminal legal system doesn't like to give people autonomy or choice, right? And that is, I think, what you just shared with is such a great example of that. So we are at time, and I want to make sure that the audience has time for questions. So I think we We're going to taking a look at the Q&A. We have a question from Kyle O'Dowd, which says, if somebody could talk about the penalties that are attached to some of the bans, for example, the bathroom bans, is anybody tracking prosecutions of these cases? And actually, Monica Milton asked a related question, which is, how are the bathroom bans playing out in terms of enforcement? So if anybody would like to answer those questions.
I don't have an answer specifically to the questions of how they are playing out in terms of prosecution, but I can offer that at least with the restrooms, 20 states are banning trans folks from accessing restrooms based on gender identity in K through 12 schools, some government spaces or all government spaces broadly, and to make it a criminal offense, which are Florida and Utah. I do expect that criminalization piece to be something that people come back to more in next session as part of, I would not be surprised if some add criminal penalties to these, but I don't know how they're actually playing out in actuality. And then the only other thing that I wanted to add in terms of criminalization is that there are 26 states and one territory that legislatively ban gender affirming care for transgender youth, but 6 of those states make providing best practice care for trans folks a felony crime. And that's Idaho, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Alabama, South Carolina, and Florida. And I do know that that has had a tremendous, tremendous chilling effect across healthcare providers generally. And we have seen some attempts to try to prosecute out of Texas in that instance.
And I also will say that, as we talk about like visually who is male and who is female, we need to also be thoughtful about the racial aspect that traditionally and historically Black women and Black femmes are not seen as feminine. So as we're seeing this play out, I just saw this in the news maybe a couple weeks ago that like a young Black woman who was like somewhat mass presenting, she went to use the women's restroom as she does. She identifies as a woman, she, her pronouns. She was roughed up by the police. She was roughed up by people who were like, you shouldn't be in there. The police were called and a situation was created. So again, just wanting to, like when we're talking about what does this look like practically, it involves harassment. It crosses the racial lines, and specifically targets and is especially violent towards people who exist at the intersection of identities.
It's also worth noting, because we haven't done so today, that everything that we've been talking about, this also plays out in every way imaginable equally in the immigration detention context. And trans people in immigration detention are experiencing all of everything that we have talked about today. So I just wanted to explicitly name that, given the horrifying state that we find ourselves in as a country right now, to specifically lift up the particular vulnerabilities for trans immigrants in this moment.
Thank you so much for bringing that into the conversation, Ian. I'm also thinking a lot about the ways in which not only these legislative attacks, but also the harmful transphobic rhetoric that people are feeling more emboldened to use publicly, how that's contributing to both the enforcement of these bans and also to the general criminalization of trans people in the discretion that law enforcement has, right? And I'm thinking about a referral that we received in the clinic. So in the clinic that I'm working at now, we're primarily doing LGBTQ criminalization work. And we received a referral out of Florida from a trans woman who was just driving her car. She was read as trans by a police officer and pulled over solely for that reason, asked for her license, and her license had been changed to female. And she was arrested and charged with fraud on that basis alone, right? And as all of the defense attorneys here know, regardless of how that case ends up, right? Even if that case gets dismissed, this is a person who has never had contact with law enforcement before. She was not doing anything unlawful. She was driving home from work, and this happened to her, and she spent a week in a men's jail before her family member was able to bail her out. And this is somebody who had spent most of her life at this point as a woman, right? And so I'm thinking about that because I want to be clear that it is not just about the legislation, right, and the enforcement of the legislation, but what, as Alana, you were talking about this sort of like climate of criminalization and people feeling empowered to do things like this. And so I think as defense attorneys, we want to be mindful of that. Let's see, we have one more question from an anonymous attendee. What role does research play in your advocacy efforts? Has it been effective in persuading difficult policymakers? And then I think that will probably be the last question.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak a little bit to that. We are very fortunate that in the movement there are multiple organizations that are doing research around messaging and how to change the narrative, how to shift the narrative overall to create increased understanding and acceptance of our trans siblings and community. I'm going to put in the chat there, and if it only goes to hosts and panelists, I'm hoping one of our hosts can flip it so that everybody can see this. But Movement Advancement Project does a lot of deep dive research into specifically how to speak to issues to a center leaning audience. So not a left leaning audience and not a too far right audience, but I would say center right audience, and how to frame things in terms of moving folks along on their journey to support. These are guides that I think can be very helpful for our attorneys to be reading. This can be helpful to even explaining in a jury situation or other legal proceedings for how to frame things. To be clear, I want to just name this up front. This is not often how community would speak to each other, how we as advocates would speak to each other, and how trans folks would describe themselves. But this is the research that is advancing policy when you have a very uninformed, very powerful base that could be making policy decisions. And some of these guides have helped us in framing ways to talk about various policies and how they would impact trans folks.
Thank you. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to take a minute and either share something that you were hoping to talk about today, or I can provide a prompt that you can respond to if you feel like doing so. So my question for you is, what are some practice tips that you would give a defense attorney or an advocate who is in the position to impact the experience of trans folks in the criminal legal system? Ian, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I wish I had great answers for that. It's such a difficult moment that we find ourselves in. You know, my immediate instinct in hearing that question, Deborah, is like that people need to share their narratives and like that's what's ultimately going to change like hearts and minds, and I think that that's all true. But I'm also aware of just the moment that we find ourselves in. I mean, going back to your previous question, like, you have leading elected officials in the country who are openly calling for the forced institutionalization of trans people in this moment. And I think the climate that we find ourselves in, personally, I'm of the view that keeping people safe, keeping people literally alive is of paramount importance. And if that means that the kind of narrative work that we'd love to be doing, because that's what's going to be winning people over, hearts and minds in the long term, if that has to go on the back burner temporarily because of this moment that we find ourselves in, then that's what has to happen because we have to keep people safe and alive. And the work that you all are doing as defense attorneys to keep people out of the criminal legal system is so essential, right? Like a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today are harm mitigation strategies for people who are in the system. Keeping people out of that system is really what is most important. So all of that work that you're doing to do that, I just would uplift and say, specifically with respect to trans and non-binary people in this moment, just understand that safety and keeping people alive is really the paramount concern.
Here, here. Thank you. Alana, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, just thank you for being here. By being here, it's clear that you care. And that is what I think trans folks need now more than ever is care, compassion, understanding, feeling seen, and as much work to be safe as possible, exactly as Ian said. And I think if there's one takeaway I would hope, it's that you now see the landscape physically, legislatively, policy-wise, that is the climate trans folks are existing in on a daily basis, and trans folks are living and breathing this. That is trauma. That is trauma. And I imagine that many of you come to a place of practicing through a trauma-informed lens. And I would simply say, take that and enhance that and ensure that you are coming from a trauma-informed place in interacting with all of your trans your trans clients because of the climate of trauma we are in right now.
Whit, any final words?
Yes, I think one of the biggest things is you're not alone and you don't have to do this alone. There are a lot of organizations, trans-led organizations that provide different services, whether it's legal services, mental health services, to folks, probably in the larger cities in your state, if we're being perfectly honest. But a lot of those organizations have networks. Do you need a court support? Do you want to have a bunch of people mob to the court with you? Do you want to think about how you're going to get in or have an organization talk about sentencing and reduce sentencing? That a lot of these organizations have programs and processes in order to provide y'all the additional support to make the judge see and understand that the person you're working with is a valued member of community. And that it's not safe for them to be in custody. And so I think one of the things is like reach out to your local trans org. It's a great resource that is so wildly underutilized.
Thank you, Whit. And on that note, I will also share that the LGBTQ Advocacy Clinic at Harvard Law School, in collaboration with the Women's Committee at NACDL, is working on developing a resource for defense attorneys representing trans people in criminal cases. And so that is set to be published in early 2026. So please keep your eye out on that if you're looking for more of like the nuts and bolts of what to do at a specific court appearance in a specific kind of case to try to decarcerate as many trans people as possible and get positive dispositions in your cases. So with that said, I want to thank all of the panelists who joined us today. I want to thank all of the attendees. We appreciate all of you being here. Thank you so much.